Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to get into something I know you're really into, the nature of art in fiction, especially when it comes to literature. You sent in some really interesting excerpts from that Filosofía del Arte y la literatura by Juan Omar Cofré, along with some pieces on art and realism from Tenet and Lukács. This is quite the collection. I think this is going to be a really fun one.
Yeah, this is a really rich mix of ideas, and I'm excited to see where our exploration takes us. I mean, it's always fascinating, right? From those classical philosophers to modern critics, there's always this grappling with what art is and what fiction does, and how it all relates to the reality we live in.
Totally. It's that ongoing debate that's been going on for I don't know, centuries.
Yeah.
I have a feeling this deep dive is going to make us question some of our own assumptions about, art. So where do we even start? I guess the obvious place would be that classic concept of art as imitation, right? Mimesis, as the philosophers like to call it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mimesis. It's, it's foundational. And when we talk about mimesis, we can't avoid talking about Plato and Aristotle. I mean, they had such different takes on what that imitation really meant. Plato, for example, he was kind of wary of art altogether. He saw the world we experience as just this shadow of the real world of forms. And he thought art, by imitating this shadow world, was like pulling us further away from the truth. It's almost like he thought art was a dangerous illusion.
Yeah, that's kind of how I remember it from, intro to philosophy. Plato was all about getting to that true essence of things, and he thought art was just this distraction, right? Like these superficial copies. But then there's Aristotle, right? Didn't he have a more positive view?
Oh yeah, for sure. While he agreed that art involves imitation, copying to a degree, he thought it could actually reveal these universal truths. By imitating human actions and emotions, he felt art could actually help us understand ourselves better and understand the world around us better. It wasn't just about creating pretty pictures, or telling entertaining stories. He thought it had a deeper purpose.
This is where things get really interesting to me because Cofré brings up this example from Taine, who talks about these crazy realistic religious statues in Naples. They're so lifelike with realistic skin and wounds. They even have jewels for eyes. But they become almost grotesque. It's like they're too real. And it kind of diminishes their artistic impact,
It really highlights how art isn't just about, slavishly copying. It's about selecting and interpreting. And ultimately, it's about expression. Even when you're aiming for realism, there's this tension between capturing those surface details, and conveying something deeper. And I think Lukács, who you also sent in some writing from, touches on this idea of the typical in realist novels. He's saying it's not just about including every little mundane detail, but about choosing details that illuminate the essence of a particular historical moment.
Right, that makes sense. In a novel, you don't need to describe every single thing the character does, throughout their whole day.
Right, you don't need their entire schedule.
Exactly. You choose the details that matter, the ones that tell us something about, their personality, their motivations, or the world that they live in.
That's it. And that brings us to this crucial point. If art isn't just a mirror to reality, then what is it? What are we actually experiencing when we, look at a painting, we read a novel, we listen to a piece of music? All of our sources seem to point to this idea that art creates its own reality, a world of fiction that's distinct from the real world. And that's where we need to get clear on our definitions. What do we mean by fiction? What do we even mean by reality?
Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. Help me out here. When we talk about fiction, are we talking about anything that's just made up? Or is there something more specific?
That's a good question. It gets to the heart of what makes art so, fascinating. In this context, fiction refers to the world created by the artist. Whether it's a painter, a writer, a filmmaker, it's a world that has its own logic, and it's coherent, even if it doesn't strictly follow the rules of our everyday reality. And that's what makes it distinct from the reality we experience day to day. That world of facts and events that we can actually observe and verify.
So, when I'm reading Don Quixote and I come across that famous opening line, in a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, I shouldn't be trying to find this village on a map.
Right, you got it.
Yeah.
That village, it exists within that fictional world of the novel.
Right.
But it doesn't correspond to an actual real place. And that's the beauty of it. You can still appreciate the tragedy of Don Quixote, be moved by his story without ever having to set foot in La Mancha.
And the same would go for a painting like Chagall's La Guerra. It's not depicting any specific battle that happened, in the real world, but it still creates this powerful world, a symbolic world of war that evokes emotions and ideas.
Absolutely. It's like Les Miserables, too. While Victor Hugo was inspired by real events, the story itself, the characters, their relationships, all of that unfolds in its own fictional reality. What's important to understand is that appreciating the art doesn't require us to know, all the real-world details that may have inspired it. The fictional world of the artwork is self-contained. It offers its own experience.
This brings up a question that I've always, wondered about. Can art be true or false? I mean, we often hear about historical films that claim to be based on a true story, but then they take all these liberties, with the actual facts.
That's a great question. It gets to the heart of what truth even means in art. It's different from factual truth, the kind we might find in a history book or a scientific report. In the world of fiction, internal consistency and the coherence matter more than historical accuracy.
So even if Les Miserables not be factually accurate in every little detail, it can still be true in the sense that it captures a certain spirit of a particular time and place and tells a compelling story about, human suffering and resilience.
Exactly. And this brings us to another interesting concept that runs through all these sources, this idea that even fictional worlds have their own rationality, their own internal logic, their own coherence. Think of it like this. Could there be a world where rabbits wear waistcoats and carry pocket watches?
Okay.
Logically, yes. It wouldn't contradict itself, right? Even if it doesn't exist in our everyday reality.
You're talking about possible worlds, right? I remember that phrase from philosophy class, but it always sounded so, mind-bending to me.
It is, but it can actually help us understand how fiction works. Alice in Wonderland is a perfect example. It's a world with its own kind of absurd but internally consistent logic. The Mad Hatter's Tea Party, the Cheshire Cat disappearing, it all makes sense within that world, even if it defies the rules of our reality.
And then there's Kafka, too. The trial, the castle, those worlds are so strange and unsettling, but they have their own bizarre coherence. It's like the rules of logic and reason have been distorted, which creates this feeling of, dread.
Exactly, and that's what makes thinking about possible worlds so exciting. It sparks our imagination, lets us see things, even familiar things, in new ways. And that's the power of art, right? By creating these possible worlds, artists can explore different ways of being, different sets of values, and really challenge our assumptions about, the world we live in.
It's like they're giving us a glimpse into, alternate realities,
Yeah.
and maybe even making us question what's real in the first place. So we've talked about art as imitation, art as creating these fictional worlds, and the logic of those worlds. But there's another piece of the puzzle here, right? The reader, the viewer, the audience. We're not just passive observers.
You've hit on a crucial point. Art isn't just about what the creator puts into it. It's also about what we, the audience, bring to it. Some theorists even talk about art as a process of reconstruction. The reader or viewer actively participates in creating meaning.
That makes sense. It's like when you read a book, your own experiences, your knowledge, even your mood at the time, all of that shapes how you understand and respond to the story.
Exactly. And that's why the same artwork can be experienced so differently by, different people. Our own unique perspectives come into play, enriching the experience, adding layers of meaning. Think about it. A reader who grew up in a war-torn country might experience, a painting about war very differently from someone who has only known peace.
That's a powerful example. It shows how art can connect with us on a personal level, even when it's dealing with these universal themes.
And that connection is what makes art so compelling. It's not just about passive observation, it's about active engagement. And that's what I love about, diving into these theoretical ideas. It gives us a new way to appreciate and understand the art that we encounter.
Totally agree. It's like you're giving me a whole new set of lenses to look through.
And speaking of new lenses, these sources also bring up some really thought-provoking challenges to how we conventionally think about art. One of them is this idea that art isn't always about communication.
Okay, now you've got me curious. How can art not be about communication? Isn't that the whole point? To express something, to share an idea, to tell a story.
That's a natural assumption, and for a lot of art, it's true. But some of these sources are pushing back on that idea that art always has to say something. Maybe it can simply be an experience, a form of expression that doesn't have this clear message or a specific meaning that it's trying to, get across.
Like abstract art, for example. it can evoke feelings, ideas, but not in a way that can be easily, translated into words.
Exactly. Or think about music. Sometimes it's just pure emotion, pure sensation. It might not be telling a story in the traditional sense, but it's still communicating something. It's almost like reducing a symphony to a telegram. You might get the gist of the message, but you miss that richness and complexity of the actual experience.
Sometimes I feel like art critics are guilty of that. They dissect a painting or a poem so much that they suck all the joy out of it. It just becomes this intellectual exercise instead of an emotional or aesthetic experience.
I see your point. Maybe focusing too much on the message can make us miss those other dimensions of art, the ones that resonate on a much deeper level. It reminds me of what Cofré says about dreaming, how dreams can be meaningful, emotionally resonant, even if they don't, always make logical sense.
That's such a great analogy. It makes me think about how certain works of art, like a surrealist painting or a piece of experimental music, can evoke these powerful feelings, associations that are almost impossible to put into words. It's like they're speaking a different language that goes beyond, our everyday understanding.
Yeah, right. And that ties into another point that Cofré discusses, drawing on the work of literary critic Felix Martinez Bonatti. They get into this concept of discourse, which is basically about how language is used in different contexts and how that relates to fiction.
Okay, this is where my brain starts to feel a little fried. Can you break that down for me a bit? What does discourse have to do with how we understand, novels and poems?
Sure. The basic idea is that in everyday speech, our words are grounded in reality. So if I say, I had coffee this morning, I'm referring to a specific event that actually happened. But in fiction, language functions a little differently. The words don't refer to real events or people. They refer to that imagined world created by the author.
So when I read Don Quixote and I come across the sentence, in a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, there lived not long since one of those gentlemen, I shouldn't be looking for this village on a map.
Exactly. The sentence is creating this village in your mind, but it doesn't correspond to a real place. It exists only within that fictional world of the novel.
But wouldn't that make the words meaningless? If they don't refer to anything real, how can they have any meaning at all?
That's the paradox of fiction, right? Martinez Bonatti suggests that words in fiction work more like iconic signs. They don't directly refer to reality in the same way as, everyday language. Instead, they represent or evoke images and ideas in our minds.
Okay, that makes sense. So the words Don Quixote don't refer to an actual person, but they conjure up this image, this eccentric knight errant in my imagination. And it's that image, that idea, that carries the meaning.
Precisely. And Cofré takes this even further, arguing that the entire world of the artwork is a kind of invention, through language. The author doesn't simply describe a pre-existing world, they create it through their words. That's why he really emphasizes this term, fictional world.
So the fictional world of 100 years of solitude with all its magical realism and fantastical events, that's just as real in its own way as the world I experience every day.
That's what Cofré seems to be getting at, yeah. He emphasizes that these fictional worlds have their own internal consistency and logic, just like our own world. It's almost like he's placing them on the same level as mathematical concepts, which exist in a realm of abstract thought, but are nonetheless real in their own way. They have their own rules, their own internal logic.
Okay, this is where my mind officially starts doing backflips. Fictional characters living in fictional worlds, and those worlds being somehow as real as the world of mathematics.
Yeah, it's definitely a heady concept, but I think what Cofré is getting at is the power of art to actually create and shape our reality. And it also highlights the role of the reader, the viewer, in actively constricting these fictional worlds in their minds.
I'm starting to see how all these ideas connect. Mimesis, fiction, possible worlds, the role of the audience. It's not just about art imitating life, it's about art creating its own reality, and that reality interacting with our own in these really fascinating ways.
Exactly, and that brings us to this, really crucial question that Cofré grapples with, especially when it comes to literature. If fictional language doesn't refer to reality in the same way as everyday speech, how does it actually convey meaning? How do we understand these stories and characters that don't, actually exist in the real world?
That's a great question. It's something I never really thought about before, but it's true. It's almost like a miracle that we can read a book and be moved by, the fate of these characters who never actually lived.
Right. It's powerful.